The Mayo Experience.
Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, presented by DraftKings 2022 Free Agency Spin, the second version. If you missed the first version, it came out on Thursday with Jake CLE. We went signing by signing with everything that had happened to that point and assessed the fantasy value of each of those guys and how it affects the real life win total value and everything like that. Now there has been more information, so we need to catch on up. Remember to smash the like button for the episode, sub to Mayo Media Network in the comment section, write something not horrible to help us with the algorithm in the comments. Share the show around, do all of that fun stuff, because I want to get into it right away, because we did not know the Deshaun Watson news when we recorded on Thursday, obviously, because it did not happen until much later on that night. Actually, it didn't happen until Friday afternoon, because at that point, it really did seem like it had been down to the New Orleans Saints and the Atlanta Falcons. That was going to be it, because the Browns were out of the running. Likely story. Turns out that was not the case. Baker demanded a trade. The Browns said they weren't going to trade him. There was a lot going on in Cleveland, and all of a sudden they end up trading 3 first-round picks, a few more in terms of the later rounds, and all of a sudden they have Deshaun Watson on their team. And not only did they trade for Deshaun Watson, they made him the highest paid quarterback in history. Guaranteed money galore. Although there is a few weird provisions in the contract, because it does sound like they are expecting him to be suspended at some point. Not sure how long that he's going to be suspended, because obviously the criminal lawsuits were dropped, or the criminal charges were dropped against him, but that hasn't stopped the NFL in the past from suspending anyone. Ben Roethlisberger kind of had the same incident years ago at this point. He was suspended by the league. So it looks like they're guessing like around 8 games. Fortunately for Deshaun Watson, that the Browns implemented a thing into his contract where he's essentially just paid $1 million the first year. So even if he's suspended, he's not really losing any money. And then they give him a raise on what he had saw from his Texans contract anyway. So the real life implications of this are kind of strange, but from a fantasy perspective, there is really no better spot for him to have landed in terms of churning out fantasy points. Now, maybe that's unfair, because obviously we know that the Bengals are good, the Ravens should be good, and the Steelers just never die, regardless of who they have on their roster. Like, their defense will be good. So one of the big keys for the Texans, even the years that they were going to the playoffs, was they would constantly be giving up points, and then Deshaun Watson would have to either let them jump out to a big lead or rally them back and cause him to throw a bunch. And with this Browns team, like, it's looking pretty formidable with like an A-type caliber quarterback. So maybe you see that their defense ends up stepping up. Maybe they can run the ball a little bit more, and maybe that takes away from the overall bottom line of the fantasy value of Deshaun Watson. Because we think of how he's going to perform. He was top 5 for 3 consecutive, his 3 healthy years or at least his last 3 healthy years. I think 2017 he blew out his knee. I think that was his rookie year, but he was on pace to be like a top 5 guy at that point too, because he does sort of the best of both worlds. When I spoke with Jake on Thursday, we talked about Carson Wentz and that year that he was the front runner for MVP. It wasn't so much that he was running the ball a ton. What was happening was he was able to elude defenders and take off when he had to and rush for a few touchdowns along the way. And Watson's sort of the elevated version of that. He's better at everything than even like primo Carson Wentz was. So he's going to rush for 3 to 6 touchdowns on the ground. He's not going to be Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson. Even Josh Allen took a little bit of a step back in terms of overall rushing attempts and yardage until we got really late in the season and in the playoffs when that became a focal point of his game again. He's not a run-first quarterback by any measure, but if he can average between 20 and 40 on the ground, a score once every 3 games, like that is a huge dynamic that's going to separate him from everyone else. We want Kyler Murray to be someone who runs all the time, because so much of his fantasy value is derived from that. When he was the number 1 overall quarterback for that early stretch 2 years ago until he became injured, he was doing like Lamar plus type stuff. He was throwing for 300 a game and he was rushing for 80 and calling his own number around the goal line at the same time. And it was just piling up fantasy points more than you can imagine. Now, what we saw from the second half of that year, and mainly all of last year as well, is he just wasn't running as much. He wasn't calling his own number as much. Especially after the first few games last year, it kind of went away completely. So I don't know if that's ever going to return to Kyler's game, because I think that's the level where you want him to be at. He's going to run more than someone like Dak Prescott will. Although Dak will still call his own number and end up with a good amount of touchdowns on the ground. He's not going to have those periphery rushing stats around it. And it's not like Watson wasn't piling up 300-plus yard games. I believe he had double digits 2 years ago, and he had the most in the league to that point. So the throwing's never going to be an issue for him. I'm just thinking about in the context of this team. What are they going to ask Deshaun Watson to do when he's playing? And this is not even putting into the ether that he might miss the first 8 games of the season, the first 6 games of the season. So that's going to make him very unattractive when it comes to fantasy drafts, especially head-to-head leagues. Although, if you could just keep a top 5 quarterback on your bench for the first half of the season, you would theoretically have him for the second half of the season. So that could turn out really well for your team, especially if you have extended benches or anything like that. But the way that it shakes down right now with Watson is he'll be playing behind an amazing offensive line for the first time in his life. He has 2 legitimate threats in the backfield to carry some of the load, be it Chubb or Kareem Hunt at this point. No Jarvis Landry, but Amari Cooper is there now, and no Austin Hooper, and David Njoku was placed on the franchise tag. So both those guys should see a massive spike in production, especially volume. Because when I spoke with Jake, we were thinking Baker or some facsimile of Baker, some backup, Case Keenum maybe, was going to end up being the quarterback. We were like, top 25 for Amari Cooper sounds about right, with the potential for a bit more, but I wouldn't go crazy on it. If all things are not going to stand as they are right now. Obviously, there's more free agency, there's more draft, there are trades to be happened. But as it stands right now, Amari is the clear alpha in this offense. He is the wide receiver 1 with a big-time quarterback throwing him the ball at this point. I think you could pretty much pencil him in as a very high-end number 2, low-end number 1 until they go out. Like, had they have gotten Allen Robinson, that would have been a bit of a different story. Even if they gotten Juju, that would have been a bit of a different story. But that's not the case that we're dealing with right now. And Njoku, I mean, he's not the greatest blocker in the world, but if you go look at his player profiler from the year that he came out of the draft, I've already seen this floating around Twitter a bunch, just like what a supreme athlete in the skill set and I wouldn't even say the intangibles, the measurables in terms of spark score and athleticism. David Njoku is one of the best in football. Now, I don't know why that wasn't able to translate at any part of his career, and you would think like 5-6 years into this, he's probably not quite the athlete he once was, but this is now a role where it's his. Unless Harrison Bryant really ends up being someone that Deshaun Watson falls in love with, then we're looking at Cooper, who was able to sustain either Hopkins or even Brandon Cooks 2 years ago as top 15 type guys. Will Fuller was amazing for the games that he played for them on a per game basis, and he still did prop up a tight end or 2 or 3, depending on who the Texans were running out there that day. They never had a consistent tight end one. If Njoku can be that guy, all of a sudden he's in like the top 10 conversation, not someone that you would go out of your way to be like, man, I need to have Njoku this year. He's going to win me fantasy leagues. I don't think anyone is saying that. What we're saying is that you can probably take him if he's not overdrafted at this point, 13th, 14th round, as someone who has the potential to be a top 5 guy, depending on the touchdown rate that he ends up coming up with. Like Irv Smith in Minnesota, I would throw into that bucket. They're not someone that you want to rely on, someone who's going to have guaranteed production. They're not a part of that tier of tight end. But with Watson, there is ceiling for Njoku, depending on the other moves that they make. Now, Donovan Peoples-Jones, with his speed, could he fill in to be that facsimile for Will Fuller in this Browns offense? Maybe. I could most definitely see that. It all really depends on who they end up getting as their wide receiver 2 or who ends up winning that job. Is it Rashad Higgins? Is it Donovan Peoples-Jones? I don't know. I can't tell you that answer. It's probably Peoples-Jones to this point. And in the Stefanski offense, it should run a bit more efficiently than maybe that there was a part of this offense that wasn't unlocked and all of us were complaining about the lack of throwing because of 2 things. One, maybe Baker couldn't legitimately make those throws and run the offense that Stefanski really wanted to run off of play action and really push the pace throwing the ball down the field. Or when we talk about Baker here in a second, he played through injury all year. And I know it was his left shoulder and a myriad other ailments, and it wasn't his right shoulder, but still, like when you dislocate any one of your shoulders and you're a quarterback, it's going to make you play through pain. It's going to throw you off balance. You're not going to have 100% of your capacity. So maybe that's one of the reasons why the passing game was down a ton last year too. And all of a sudden Beckham leaves, goes to the Rams, and all of a sudden he looks like Odell Beckham again, where he just did not in Cleveland at any point of his tenure there. So maybe that's on Baker. Maybe that's on the offense. I'm not really sure. But with Watson, those problems should be solved. Now, how much does a year away from football affect Deshaun Watson? Couldn't tell you. No idea. Almost have to treat it like if you're going to draft him or target him, you have to treat it like it didn't make a difference whatsoever. Maybe he even got better with a year of rest and allowed his body to heal. You have no idea how that's going to work, but you could talk yourself into the case of fading him because, oh yeah, he's rusty. He might be suspended 8 games. Sure. If you're drafting him this upcoming year, and obviously by the time you do drafts, you're going to have a bit more information than this, that even if he is suspended, as long as he can reach his peak potential, there's no easier position to fill in the interim than quarterback. So you should be fine in that regard. So it's a big boost for everyone. I mean, Nick Chubb, no, not really, because he's going to be what he is. No matter who is healthy and who is injured on the Cleveland Browns, as we've seen with Nick Chubb out of that backfield, his role is just written in stone. So if Kareem Hunt gets hurt, they'll find some other jabroni to come in and take half the snaps or 40% of the snaps and be used as a pass catcher, where the opposite way doesn't work like that. When Chubb gets hurt, it's all Kareem Hunt. It's all Dearness Johnson, who's not there anymore. But that's what we saw this year, that when one of those guys goes down, it's a full-on workhorse back role for the other guy, but it does not necessarily translate to when the backup is hurt for Nick Chubb. They like to deploy Nick Chubb in a very methodical way. Maybe it's to keep him fresh and try to make him a Derrick Henry type figure where when they need him in the second half to break off these big chunk runs, which he does, and use that power running game, that he is not going to be burnt out from the first half. Maybe they just know that about him. And listen, we clamored for this for years as fantasy people. Like we saw it with Lamar Miller in Miami all those years. It's like, oh man, if they just gave him 20 touches a game, he would score so many points. And then they gave him 20 touches a game in Houston. He scored exactly the same amount of points. The more you increased his volume, the more you dropped his efficiency, which goes hand in hand, obviously. But it was a precipitous drop-off for him in that circumstance, is what we're looking for. So that's the Cleveland offense with Watson. So I guess that brings us to Baker now. What are we doing with Baker? Someone is going to give Baker a chance, and you can kind of boil it down to just a few names. And there's really a bunch of different teams that kind of fall into this mix, because Jameis is now rumored to be going back to New Orleans to fill their need. I'm guessing Matt Ryan is staying in Atlanta unless he feels slighted by the franchise like Baker did by Cleveland by wanting to go out and acquire Deshaun Watson, coming up with this huge package. At least in New Orleans, they need to go sign someone to play quarterback for them, even if they're bringing back Jameis. He's currently a free agent. Jimmy G is still out in the ether. It's looking more and more like he might just stay in San Francisco at this point unless someone really wants to pony up and trade for Jimmy G. I thought that he would be gone. He seems to feel like he's going to be gone, but something about that coaching staff doesn't like Trey Lance. Maybe someone should go trade for Trey Lance, and that could be a potential opportunity here. So you have Jameis, Matt Ryan, Jimmy G. Josh Johnson signed as Russell Wilson's backup in Denver, which is actually a really nice fit. Go team XFL and Josh Johnson. He was even all right with the Jets and mop up. You don't want Josh Johnson starting for your franchise, more than a game. But if you need a game or someone to come in after a quarter when someone gets hurt, you can do a lot worse than Josh Johnson. He's been around. Guy knows almost every single playbook in the NFL. He can adapt to any sort of situation. This would actually be one of the better situations he had ever been put in should anything happen to Russell Wilson with the amount of playmakers on Denver right now. And then you have Baker. I assume we should probably throw Jordan Love into this mix as well, only because with Rodgers back for Lord knows how long. 3 years, let's say, minimum. 2 years minimum, probably 3 years in Green Bay for Aaron Rodgers. What do you do with first-round pick Jordan Love? He's just sitting there. He did not look great against the Kansas City Chiefs in his start last year, filling in for COVID Rodgers when he was out, but do you really want to run it down the well with Baker? Someone who maybe you do talk yourself into he was just so injured last year and now he's healthy that he can get back to being efficient Baker, the guy that broke a ton of NFL rookie passing records. I mean, that's potentially on the table. How much do you have to trade to get him right now? Probably not a ton, to tell you the truth. I did see PFT commentator was talking about, this is great for, they somehow shifted the narrative that Baker should be humbled a little bit on the way out the door. It's like this franchise, they made him play, or he at least elected to, or the franchise made him play through myriad injuries last year. That was clearly affecting his performance, and now he's just enemy number one of the state in Cleveland, at least in terms of their franchise and organization. We need to get him out the door, although they wanted him back 2 days ago. Now they don't want anything to do with him. So you can probably squeeze him away for relatively little at this point. It'll probably take a little bit more to get Matt Ryan, theoretically, but then you have to take on his salary. You probably don't want to do that for an aging Matt Ryan unless you were a team on the cusp. And none of these teams who need quarterbacks outside of Indy are really on the cusp. Do you really think that Seattle is on the cusp? No. No one thinks that. Carolina? I mean, they've really padded their offensive line. They went out and got a new center. They went and they got a new right guard. Their offensive line was trash a year ago. Right now, they're bringing back Sam Darnold. Baker going to Carolina would be hilarious. That you would just have the first and third picks from that draft already on their second team, starting for a new franchise. Well, Lamar is not necessarily setting the world on fire as of last year, but he won an MVP. Very good quarterback. Josh Allen consistently in the MVP hunt. And I mean, I suppose it could be worse. You could have drafted Josh Rosen that year, but these two are just, on a second franchise already, which is mind-boggling to me. I don't think that Carolina will go after Baker, but I don't think they go after Darnold either. So here we are. Baker to the Colts makes the most sense. It's whether the Colts want him or not. And is Baker where the Colts are I would say that the Colts are very close. They're one competent quarterback away from making a run. Like, is Baker better than Wentz? No. Maybe. Yes. The same. I think he's in that tier with Wentz, who I don't think is like all that good. I don't think he's a transcendent quarterback, but you could potentially make the case that Baker is someone that could elevate his game, become better than that. And then if you're running sort of the high, like, is Baker better than Jimmy G? No, probably not, right? So if you could trade 2/3 or a third or a second or whatever it might be to get Jimmy G, and you're a team that has aspirations of winning the division, competing for a Super Bowl with a really good offensive line, a pretty good defense, an immaculate running game, not a ton of weapons in that offense in terms of the receiving game, but if you're the Colts, are you better off bringing in Jimmy G than Baker Mayfield? I think they're all the same part of that bucket that was right around Carson Wentz. And you just got rid of Carson Wentz. So I know a lot of that had to do with salary, and you did get something for him, which was stunning. I know what the Commanders are up to, but that's for a different, actually, that's not even for a different day. We broke that down 2 weeks ago. Me, Cuss, and Feinberg talking about how that makes no sense. And of course, Cuss loved Carson Wentz because that only makes sense, right? But Jameis, I just don't know what these teams are going to do. Obviously, they need quarterbacks. I don't think that Seattle is going to roll with Drew Lock. Jameis back to New Orleans, I guess you can draw the most dotted lines towards that. The Fitzmagic, if his hip is healthy, I don't know. Why not Fitzmagic? He's going to go Chuck if that's what you're looking for. Probably not what the Colts or Browns are looking for. Obviously, the Browns don't need that anymore. But Seattle, you have two very capable receivers. Just here's a guy who can get them the ball. He'll get the other team the ball, too. You don't need to worry about that part of it. He's going to be wildly inefficient, but he's going to find your guys downfield if he's healthy. So maybe Fitzpatrick could be in this mix. I would have said the same thing about Jameis, too, although we saw Jameis last year. Honestly, before he got hurt, he didn't look like old Jameis at all. He wasn't taking those risks down the field, and it hurt his fantasy production, but his real-life production wasn't too bad. Doesn't love throwing to backs out of the backfield, which would be fine for Seattle. Not so much when you have Alvin Kamara, who's one of the best running backs in football, especially out of the backfield. Maybe you should try to get him the ball. I don't know. Baker would be good for slant boy, though. Michael Thomas would be eating that up over and over until he would start throwing behind him or something like that, then we'd all be outraged at Baker the entire time. So I have no idea where he's going to go. I know that he wants to go to the Colts. Whether or not the Colts want him or not, this is like a sophomore in high school. You pine after your lucky lady or your lucky man out there, and they just don't feel the same way. That could be the case with the Colts and Baker Mayfield right now. So keep an eye out. I don't think he's going to command much on the open market here in a trade, though. He might even get cut at some point. Seeing Baker as a backup this year and Trubisky as a starter is just like, it hurts the mind to think about that potential scenario going into last season. But hey, the NFL changes very rapidly. So here we are in that circumstance. One thing we also did not hit was Davante Adams. I don't quite understand. I mean, I do understand this. Anytime you can go out and get Davante Adams, one of the premier wide receivers in football, I think you just say you do it. Of course, you make him the highest paid wide receiver of all time. Although, looking at the numbers, it's really a 3-year deal that's worth a ton of money. It's not going to be the 5 years. He's not going to be there the 5 years. Unless they are winning Super Bowls because of Davante Adams, he's not going to be there super long term. He'll be there for 3 years, maybe even be a cap casualty before that if the Raiders suck. And the thing is, the Raiders need to be really good just to compete in this division, which is absolutely loaded. I don't understand how you can look around and listen, maybe Russell Wilson to Denver, he saw the options and was like, you know what? I'm going to make this work. I think this team has a lot of potential. And all these free agents coming to the Los Angeles Chargers on defense, being like, hey, we can really bolster this up. And now Davante Adams, maybe that was the only suitor. Maybe the Raiders were the only team that was like, hey, here's the first, here's the second, we'll take them off your hands, and we're going to pay you. And it made a lot of logical sense for Green Bay to do that because they just legitimately could not afford to keep him at this point because they don't want to play around with the dead cap money and mix everything around. They're not capologists. Maybe they should go hire the guy on the Saints who seems to come up with $40 million of free money every single year for the New Orleans cap, but they're just not doing that in Green Bay, so they couldn't keep Davante Adams. More on that in a second. In terms of the Packers receiving game right now, which is not great. But everyone's looking around being like, you know whose division I want to go to? That guy, Patrick Mahomes, the best quarterback in football. Maybe there's like a pride thing where it's like, oh, if we can just knock off Patrick Mahomes, we're going to be sitting pretty. Like, why not just go to the NFC where no one is anymore? There's Brady, there's Rodgers, and and Stafford, I suppose, and the Rams, who are running it back once again, and now adding Allen Robinson. But that's 3 teams. 7 of you make the playoffs. The Raiders got in the weirdest way possible last year, and they wildly overachieved. Do we think that they're going to achieve those same heights when both the Chargers and Broncos got significantly better than the Raiders got in the offseason so far to this point, and the Chiefs are still the Chiefs? Seems really stupid. I don't get it. And especially spending all this money right now. I guess that you're new to Vegas. You need to put a competitive football product on the field. But I don't want to say that they should necessarily be tanking. But until they find a real quarterback, nothing against Carr. He's in that. He's better than Wentz. He's better than Jimmy G. He's better than Baker, slightly. But he's not Deshaun Watson good. He's not Russell Wilson good. He's not Justin Herbert good. He's not Patrick Mahomes good. Until you solve that problem, or you have like the best defense in the league or something crazy like that, it's not really going to make that much of a difference. Almost like the argument that I made of, I don't understand why the Commanders traded for Wentz. Like, what is your ceiling with this team? First round exit? Great news. Does the revenue really mean that much to you that you would you're going all in to get knocked out in the first round at best if you make the playoffs? Come on. No one wants to cheer for a franchise like that. Maybe you do. I don't know where your priorities are at, but it would not be for me. I want my team swinging for the fences in these type of situations. I either be bad enough that you can turn it around and be really good. I don't condone what Jacksonville's doing, spending a bunch of money on the absolute goober free agents who all suck. Like, great. When you can spend like $80 million and not move the needle whatsoever outside of offensive line, which is good for Trevor Lawrence. But to bring in like C- playmakers? Yeah, great. And fantastic news. Spend all your money. That's great. At least getting Davante Adams is a real needle mover. So for the purposes of fantasy football, obviously this hurts Hunter Renfrow the most. Is it a huge upgrade for Derek Carr? I would say slightly. Is he a top 10 quarterback? Probably not. Is he better than Russell Wilson? Fantasy-wise? Maybe would be my answer. Probably not. And we think that Russell Wilson's probably between like the 8th and 15th best quarterback in fantasy with the fact that he doesn't run anymore. Derek Carr doesn't run at all. So that unless you're Tom Brady throwing for 50 touchdowns and almost 6,000 yards, which Carr is not going to do, then what's your ceiling? Your ceiling is like the 10th best quarterback. That's why you don't take him. In 2 quarterback leagues, he'll fall because no one wants him. And when he's being drafted as the 24th quarterback overall, yeah, in a 2 quarterback league, if he's 14th, that's a real value. But in a 1 quarterback fantasy league, please, no thanks to Derek Carr. I don't think we're going to see over 100 catches or around that for Hunter Renfrow again this season. Even Darren Waller. Josh McDaniels might have a new system, and maybe that leans a lot towards towards the tight end, and maybe we see a more consistent Darren Waller because he's still he's a matchup nightmare for defenses because of his size and because of his speed and where he lines up on the field. But I wouldn't really be too concerned about him. I think we're talking about a top 5, top 6 tight end overall with the potential to be number 1. That's a lot of it has to do with consistency and touchdowns, but that's where I would not put him as like the favorite to be number 1. I'd put him as the favorite to be like number 4, number 5, something like that. But if you're in that tier of tight end, you do have the chance to be the best one. If Kelsey gets hurt or Andrews has a down year, whatever it might be, maybe Pitts regresses because legitimately there's no one else in that offense. There's different circumstances where you could envision a path of Waller being tight end 1, even with Davante Adams there. Renfrow, he was a tight end or wide receiver number 1 this year. It's not going to be the case this year. How low does he fall? That's tough. I don't know how this new offense is going to run with Josh McDaniels. If he plays the Jacoby Myers and or Wes Welker, Julian Edelman type role as low A-dot slot guy, he could still end up with like 80 catches, which would be good. But That now makes him a best case scenario wide receiver 2, more likely low end number 3, high end number 4, and maybe due to a lack of consistency. The biggest thing I'm having trouble parsing is, what do we do with Davante Adams? Is Davante Adams going to be the best wide receiver in football on the field? Probably, because he is the best wide receiver. He's in a handful of guys who can be considered the best wide receiver in football. Will he be fantasy's best receiver without Aaron Rodgers? I don't think he's going to be. No. Is he still going to be drafted inside the top 5? Maybe. I'm not taking him there. I actually thought that if he was still in Green Bay, I would probably draft him over Cooper Kupp. I thought that was a legitimate case you could make this year. With, obviously Kupp's not going to do what he did again by breaking every NFL record. So just natural regression down from that, and then potential skill regression. There's more mouths to feed there now. Another year in this offense. Maybe Robert Woods comes back. And this isn't to downgrade Cooper Kupp. I'm just making a case that maybe he doesn't have 2,300 yards this year. If he ends up with 1,700 yards, someone could out-touchdown him. Or maybe Adams could up his game if he was still in Green Bay. But he was the only option in Green Bay. They had specific goal line packages for him to make sure that he scored double-digit touchdowns every single year. You really think Vegas is going to have that? Well, A, they don't have Aaron Rodgers, so they're not going to throw for as many touchdowns, or at least be as efficient in the red zone. Maybe they will run pick plays where Adams can still get his in the end zone every single time, but it's just not going to be the same. Even if you cut those in half, those amount of targets, those amount of looks from inside the 5, inside the 10-yard line, that's going to severely impact his overall touchdown upside. Maybe he's good enough to overcome it, scores longer touchdowns, it doesn't matter. But the Packers' offense was so devoid of talent that he was a magnet for targets, right up around 30% of a target share in an offense. It's not going to be the case this year. It could be 28%, maybe. But coming from Derek Carr, that's not as valuable as 30% coming from Aaron Rodgers. And just the amount of designed routes where he's the first look inside the 5, inside the 10, leading to touchdowns in that Packers offense, with Aaron Rodgers able to fit it into tight windows better than anyone else in football, you have to expect that number is just going to go down. So is he wide receiver 1 in fantasy? No, I don't think that he is. Could you come up with a case where he's outside the top 5? Yeah, I think I'm going to. I want to gestate on this just a little bit, but I would have to think that there's more of a floor in play now, rather than just, his ceiling being his floor in Green Bay, which it's been every single year. Maybe that's an overreaction. Maybe Carr is better than this. And maybe with these weapons that he's going to take this leap, all of a sudden he's like the DeMar DeRozan of the NFL, where, it's like age 31 season. There's a real leap. I would find that hard to believe. It wouldn't be the craziest thing to ever see. I would just have a hard time believing it. So Adams is probably going to be wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5, wide receiver number 6, depending on how the other options come in. I'm trying to just rack my brain to think about who would I have ahead of him. And, it's tough to figure out who you're going to have ahead of him at the same time. So, Hopkins won't be there. Maybe he still is inside the top 5, just through other options. Would you draft CeeDee Lamb, or would you draft Davante Adams? I think that's a legitimate discussion that you could have. The answer is probably still Adams, but I think that wouldn't even be in the stratosphere of a legitimate debate. I think it's right around there at that point now, based on how these offenses look with the personnel that they have in these offenses and just the different schemes that we're going to see. Do we really think that Josh McDaniels is going to be a great coach? I don't. No, I don't. I don't think he's going to be that good. So, maybe if they get Gronk, maybe if they can run some sort of facsimile of the New England offense from years ago, and hopefully Carr can play 90% as well as Brady, that's a big ask. Maybe it could look all right. We'll see. Now, in Green Bay, they have Allen Lazard, Amare Rodgers, and Randall Cobb. That's not good. So they're going to draft someone. They're going to sign someone. I'm actually kind of stunned Allen Robinson didn't go there, to tell you the truth. The running backs are still going to be fine out of the backfield. They'll still have both with Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. Maybe just convert Aaron Jones to be like a Cordero Patterson type running back / receiver and have A.J. Dillon on the field at the same time. But it does seem like a massive downgrade. It is a massive downgrade, losing the best receiver in football, especially the one that your quarterback has had the best connection with of anyone ever, and he's the back-to-back MVP. I do think that Rodgers will be fine, but I do think that he is on that tier fantasy-wise with Wilson and Carr and all those guys, just because he's not going to be a huge runner unless they go out and get an option and a half more to make them credible in terms of the passing game. He'll still get his. He'll still be wildly efficient. He'll prop up random dudes across the field. they're going to do something, so it's impossible to assess how their passing game is going to look. But the lack of running from Rodgers, even in the MVP year, what did he finish last year? Like quarterback number 7? Great. So if he's not MVP, what does he finish? He's just not as good fantasy-wise. He's good in individual fantasy games because of the high touchdown upside, but he's just not out there like dropping 500 on people and running for 80 on the ground. He's just not that type of player at this point. He's just too damn efficient to do that, and that hurts his fantasy numbers overall, especially not throwing the picks. Like, sometimes you want your quarterback to be throwing picks from a fantasy perspective, because that's going to foster scoring on the other side, which is going to foster more throwing from your quarterback for more yardage, more touchdowns, more running, more everything. Rodgers doesn't play those games. So I'd rather have Brady than have Rodgers right now. And I don't think it's particularly close at this point in a fantasy sense. So stay tuned on what's going to happen in Green Bay. Allen Robinson going to the Rams. Got to think that this is an indictment of the health of Robert Woods at this point. Or maybe they just, I doubt Beckham plays at all this year. So does Robinson take Robert Woods' role? Does he take Van Jefferson's role? Are they upset with Van Jefferson? Obviously, Kupp is going to command his 30% of the targets. That's going to happen. He's going to be drafted as wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. I don't think that bringing in Allen Robinson or even bringing in a Allen Robinson and having a healthy Robert Woods back week 1, well, that seems a bit far-fetched at this point. I don't think it's going to affect Cooper Kupp at all, so let's not worry about Cooper Kupp. In the pantheon of everything else, there was clearly a lack of rapport between Matt Stafford and Robert Woods. He was averaging 5 targets a game before he got hurt. Now, it was picking up a little bit towards right before he ended up getting hurt, but once we saw Beckham take over as the number 2 in this offense, after being ingrained a little bit, he started putting up consistent fantasy value. I could see, honestly, Allen Robinson, depending on how much Robert Woods does, if he's truly right and truly healthy in this offense, he could be a wide receiver too. It's probably lofty-ish, but for years, the Goof was able to foster both Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods as wide receiver 2s. Obviously, that gap has shifted, but they do throw the ball enough, and Robinson's a big-bodied presence. He's a very good receiver near the end zone. He uses his body very well, uses big frame, he boxes out, he contorts well, he goes up to the highest point and gets the ball, very strong hands. He's a legitimate touchdown threat. He's one of the few players in the NFL you can throw the ball up to in the end zone if it's near him, and he's going to go get it. We didn't really see that in Chicago because when were they near the end zone? Never. So how's that going to work out? Plus, he was injured for most of last year too. And after he returned from COVID, wasn't the same guy. So it seemed like it really impacted him. Hopefully he's good this year. I would say he's going to be drafted as a low-end wide receiver 3. That's where he should be drafted because obviously the floor is completely unknown. But there is potential upside here, and he's probably better than Robert Woods this year. Robert Woods, if he does return at some point and he is healthy, I think he'll be consistent. He'll get a few carries along the way, but he's primarily there to block on the outside because he's so damn good at sealing the edges for a lot of these Rams runners. It's crazy to think. We saw their lack of running game in the Super Bowl, and even towards the end of the year, that unless one guy's just doing it all himself, the loss of Robert Woods is huge for the running game of the Los Angeles Rams. He is so good at that, and that's something that never really gets taken into consideration. It was when they signed him. That's why they gave him all that big money coming from Buffalo. But when we think about how good players are blocking for tight ends, because obviously we're talking about fantasy 99% of the time, and that's just bad news. It was like when Kittle was blocking towards the end of last year. They're like, yeah, they really need him to block or their quarterback's going to die. Therefore, he wasn't catching any passes. It's like, oh, Kittle sucks. It's like, no, he just happens to be the best blocking tight end in football now that Gronk's not in his prime anymore. And that's just going to lead to fewer targets. It's going to lead to fewer routes and fewer fantasy points. So that's why I would have Robinson over Robert Woods at the moment. Juju ends up signing with the Kansas City Chiefs. Obviously, no Sammy Watkins. I don't know how good this can really turn out for him because when the Chiefs are rolling, and maybe it's a situation where if something happens to Tyreek or something happens to Kelsey, all of a sudden, Juju's a wide receiver too. Plausible. I feel like that wide receiver 2 / let's call it for what it is. It's the wide receiver 3 after Kelsey and Hill, who combined for over 50% of those teams' targets. Maybe Kelsey's a bit on the decline. I don't necessarily buy that. Hill's going to be Hill until he's not Hill anymore. So let's allocate 55% of targets for those 2 guys. Now we have 45% of targets for everyone else on the team. That includes all the running backs. That includes Mecole Hardman, Byron Pringle, Demarcus Robinson. If he's still there, who knows? They'll find someone else. And now Juju into the mix. I would put Juju as the front runner of all that. He just strikes me as a guy you're never going to know when to play. A lot like Sammy Watkins. Sammy Watkins had some nice years in Kansas City. When you look at the overall stat line, you're like, Didn't he have like 2 good games a year? They caught 2 passes in every game? Yeah, that's what Sammy Watkins did. Juju might be more effective than those guys, than at least Sammy Watkins, and more consistent than Sammy Watkins, but it's going to be a lot of low A-dot routes, and Kelsey runs a lot of those anyway. Like those pick plays and short routes that Mahomes throws for first downs to keep the chains moving, those generally go to Kelsey and Hill. So if Juju was stepping in and that role didn't exist for anyone else on the team, that would be one thing, but it already does. Every single year, a lot like Evan Ingram, as we saw, basically since he's been a rookie, he's seen his average depth of target go down. Now, that could be playing with Ben Roethlisberger, who has noodle arm, and Mahomes obviously does not have noodle arm, so maybe it goes back and is increasing. I think it's an interesting gamble, but I think a lot of people are going to think it's an interesting gamble, and that usually is a recipe for someone just building a bunch of steam in the preseason, getting overdrafted, wildly underperforming, and then being dropped after 5 weeks. When he has one big game in week 2 and then 4 stinkers around it, no one wants to have that guy on their team. That's what Juju is shaping up. Now, he could score 14 touchdowns because he runs these short routes. He's going to see tertiary coverage. That's more of a role he's comfortable with. That's possible. I just wouldn't be betting on that. As a value pick, yes. As being drafted right around where the ADP is going to go, like around 10, around 11, around 12, sure. There's very few bad picks from that range because you don't expect them to be starters. So if those players start on your team, that's fantastic news. Now you start drafting them in the 6th round, the 5th round, because, the Chiefs offense, it's not going to turn out well for anyone. Trust me on that. Austin Hooper goes to Tennessee. Obviously, they cut Julio Jones, so he's still lingering out there. Maybe he goes to Cleveland, now that I think about it, or even Green Bay at that point. Not that I would love that. I would love him more as a wide receiver 2 or 3 on a team, rather than trying to be a wide receiver 1, which he probably would be on Green Bay. So maybe not Green Bay for his fantasy purposes. Cleveland would be much better for him if he can stay healthy. But this leaves us with A.J. Brown. There's a lot of tight ends there. I don't know who's going to end up sticking on this team, but Hooper's the best pass catcher of this bunch, and we know that Tannehill likes throwing to tight ends, not necessarily just one tight end. It's like a collection of 3 guys, a lot like they do in Miami, where it's like Gesicki and the 14 other guys they have playing tight end. Tennessee is now shaping up to be very much in that same vein. So I can see it. I'd rather have Njoku, for example. So I'm not, until I see what cuts are made, what they do with this offense, maybe a tight end 1, probably not, is probably the easiest way to go about it. So the rest of the free agents since we've last talked, and again, you can find the show up on the pod feed. You can find it down in the description or just up on Mayo Media Network right now. James Washington to Dallas. Maybe that means that Michael Gallup isn't as far along as we think. Maybe he's not ready for the beginning of the season. Boston Scott has been re-signed by Philadelphia. So the unleashing of Kenneth Gainwell or Miles Sanders, that's going to have to wait because now we have another wrench into the system. Plus Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts is one. Like, would you rather have to go off topic here, Jalen Hurts this year or Deshaun Watson? The answer is Jalen Hurts, by the way, as a fantasy quarterback. Unless we know for sure that Watson is going to start week 1 and will never be suspended, which it doesn't seem like we'll know that, or he will be suspended. Those seem to be the 2 options that we have on the table right now. So I would say that they're close, and obviously Watson has a much better chance of never being benched. I don't think that Hurts should be benched. I think that he gets better in year 3. You would at least think that he would, but the way that he runs, he's like a cheat code at fantasy, and you don't ever want to give that up. Yeah, in terms of points per game, he's inside the top 5 last year. You can talk about how, he can't make this throw. He's not that good. Philly's never winning a Super Bowl. Completely agree. Fantasy-wise, dude is legit. And sometimes there's a stark reality between fantasy and reality. And letting your real life assessment of a player cloud the fact that they may be good in fantasy, stupid. That's how you lose fantasy championships. Definitely not how you win them, tell you that much. And Johnny Hekker went to the Panthers. I talked about the 2 offensive linemen. They re-signed DJ Moore. It's being set up as a good quarterback can come in and take over and make this offense pretty good. They also signed Donta Foreman as well, so that probably means cut Chuba Hubbard. Will we see McCaffrey? I don't know. Maybe he gets traded at some point. But it all depends on the quarterback that they bring in. Right now, the pickings are slim, put it that way. But Johnny Hekker could be their best thrower on the team. When it's between him and Sam Darnold, I've seen Hekker throw enough trick plays on the Rams. The arm's not so bad. Maybe better than Darnold. We'll see. Anyway, that will do it on the Pat Mayo Experience. Again, you can check out Thursday's show with Jake CLE as we go through the first wave of free agents. This is now the second wave in Deshaun Watson, and that'll do it for me. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!